Good evening, church. Good to see you tonight. Glad you're here. Did you have a good afternoon? All right. We are going through the 7 letters to the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, and we've come to letter number 6 in Revelation chapter 3. If you want to open your New Testament to Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10. Verse 10 is one of the interesting verses in the entire book of Revelation, actually, because for many people this is a critical verse for the revelation about what's called the pre-tribulation rapture. And there's a lot of discussion and books written about this. It's quite the theological debate. What I intend to do is point out to you, as we go through the book of Revelation, the several places where a pre-tribulation rapture is said to be supported by the text. There are more than one, and we'll actually come to another one pretty quickly. And we'll talk about each one of those as we come to them. Our discussions will probably get shorter and shorter as you get more and more familiar with the materials, and you can decide whether you think these verses support that contention or not. Let's just do a quick review. I think most of you probably know what I mean when I say pre-tribulation rapture, but the grand scheme of the timeline of the New Testament ages, it comes from a book in the Old Testament. Which book is that? Try again. No, not Exodus. The timeline scheme for the end times comes kind of from an Old Testament book, which is Daniel. Thank you, Marilyn. Book of Daniel, chapter 9, talks about weeks. 70 weeks. And the weeks are years, most people agree. And he starts the time clock when the temple is actually when the decree for the temple to be rebuilt and for Jerusalem to be rebuilt is made. Remember, the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and all of his armies. And for 70 years, God's people were in Babylon. Daniel was there, and he received some revelations about history. And one of them was the 70 weeks. And 69 of those weeks, 69 times 7, we got any math whizzes in here? No? But you have a calculator on your phone. It's 483 years is what it works out to. Yeah. And what's really astounding about this is that historically it actually works out right from the time that the proclamation was made for the temple to be rebuilt, for Jerusalem to be rebuilt, until the time that Jesus came was 483 years. So that really catches your eye when you realize that. So that's 69 of the weeks are used up. And the way that most people understand this is that the clock was sort of stopped there. In that 70th week, which would be a period of 7 years, is just put on hold. And it's just waiting for the clock to start again. And the entire time between the 69th year and the 69th week and the 70th week is what some people call a parenthesis in the time of God's plan, or the church age, where God is working specifically through the church. The kingdom is represented by the church, as we talked about this morning. When we get later in the book of Matthew, we're going to hear Jesus say to the religious leaders in Jerusalem, the kingdom is being taken away from you and being given to a people who will bear its fruit. Now that's a striking thing. He's saying that God is, in a sense, altering his understanding or his covenant with Israel to some degree, and including the church as the new representative of the kingdom. Now, it doesn't leave Israel out, because the church is the Jewish Gentile church. The Gentiles were grafted in Romans chapter 9 tells us. So all of this affects the entire theology of the Bible. It's all very, very connected, and it becomes a fascinating pursuit to read about. But back to our 70 weeks. So the 69 weeks have already been spent, and we're waiting for the 70th week or 7-year period to begin. That 7-year period, most theologians believe, will be 3.5 years of peace. And again, this comes from prophecies in the New Testament. 3.5 years of peace, and then 3.5 years of tribulation. The Great Tribulation, the Bible talks about. So the question is, for those who believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, is can you find in the Bible definitive theological evidence that God's people will be raptured, taken out of the world at the beginning of this 7-year period? There are also other camps. There's the mid-tribulation rapture camp, which would mean that God's people stay in the world for the first 3.5 years, the period of peace, and then they're taken out of the world. And then there's the post-tribulation rapture, and those are people who believe that God's people will be here for even through the difficult times of the Great Tribulation. So that's the debate. Many of you probably already knew that. Some of you maybe didn't. If that's still confusing and you want to know, come and ask me in the hallway, and I'll try to go through it again with you or give you some materials that would help you to understand it. So to kind of give you a foresight into all of this, the Bible absolutely teaches that there's some kind of rapture. The word is harpazo, and it means to be snatched away. And that word actually only occurs one time in the book of Revelation, and it's not in chapter 3. That doesn't mean that chapter 3 is not talking about it, but it's part of the evidence. Probably one of the texts that you're most familiar with about the rapture is in 1 Thessalonians. Now, somebody that's got a good, strong reading voice, I'm going to get you to read this text. You know, the person that just happens to jump out at me is Blake Doss. Blake, find 1 Thessalonians. Yeah. Now, I know I'm going to hear from Jack. Find 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and read verses 15, 16, and 17, if you would please, nice and loud for everybody. 16 and 17. That's probably the best description in the Bible of the rapture. It gives us a lot of details. But one thing it does not give us is what? It doesn't say anything about the time. There's no chronological setup here because it wasn't important to Paul when he wrote this letter. In fact, why is he even writing about this? They were. This was late enough in the first century that Christians had begun to die. And the ones who were alive were concerned about that. Well, what about them? When Jesus comes back for us, are they going to be left behind? And Paul writes to them, he says, no, they won't. And you heard the answer that he gives. So this is not and this is true of the entire New Testament. If the New Testament drives you crazy in trying to figure out times and dates and schemes, here's why. It wasn't written for any of that. It's written for pastoral reasons. Read the very next verse, Blake. Therefore, encourage each other with these words. Paul didn't write this to answer questions primarily. He wrote it so that we would be encouraged, or especially the Thessalonians, but us too. So the focus of all the letters in the New Testament, including the book of Revelation, is pastoral. And that's why they kind of frustrate us, because we come to it with non-pastoral questions, and it gives us pastoral answers. So what we have here is clear evidence that there's some kind of rapture where Jesus comes back and the trumpet blows and the archangel shouts and the Lord descends and the people are snatched away to be with Him in the air, and they're with Him forever. The big question is, so the question is not, is there a rapture? The Bible gives us an emphatic yes to that question. The only question is really, what's it going to be like, and when? When will it happen? Kathleen? Most people would say that the rapture is only the church, and that the Old Testament saint will be dealt with in a different manner. Yes, that's a good question. Is it possible that only some of the church would be raptured? Have you ever heard anybody say that? I hadn't either, and so when I thought of it, I thought there was something wrong with me. Let's look at this verse again now. Verse 10 in chapter 3 of Revelation says, "Because you have kept the word of my" what? Perseverance. Anybody else have anything else? Everybody's perseverance? Endurance. Those are the two most popular words. Because you have kept the word of my endurance. Now, you probably don't have it worded quite like that, but that's the way the words are set up. What does that mean? Because you have kept the word of my endurance. My being Jesus. Jesus is the one speaking. Probably not. Holding fast to their faith. Well, that's a good question, Jackie. Why would something similar to this not be in the letters to the other churches? And I think one very quick answer to that would be that all of the letters in the New Testament take on authority for any believer. And so it wouldn't necessarily have to be there. But you're still raising an important question, because the teaching of the pre-tribulation rapture is so emphasized by some Christian teachers that you would expect that it would be mentioned all over the Bible, right? And that's one of the things that, for me in my pilgrimage, was confusing, because I listened to Bible teachers who so emphasized the pre-tribulation rapture that I thought that was a major theme of doctrine in the New Testament. Then when I read the New Testament and realize that it's not, it's kind of like getting the chair pulled out from underneath you. Yeah. Doesn't mean it's not true, but it's not the emphasis for the New Testament writers that some people today give to it. All right? They will overcome death. Yes, you're right about that. But in their endurance here, it may actually cost them their lives. That's exact, and that's the question that I'm asking. Tammy has pointed out the real question here. Jesus says, the word of my endurance. It is Jesus. So why is he saying my endurance? This is really important for our next Sunday morning text. Our next Sunday morning text, coming back to what you said, Jackie, when I started to study the New Testament, I found a different emphasis. The emphasis that I found in the New Testament is the crucified life, the cross life, the life that is a life of endurance and perseverance, a life that's willing to sacrifice like Jesus does. That's not something that is sparse. That's something that is all over the place. And Jesus is going, now that Peter has confessed who Jesus is, he is going to begin to give them new revelation starting next Sunday morning in our text. He's going to begin to show them that he must go to Jerusalem and that he must die and on the third day be raised again. And Peter's going to pull him aside and say, no, that can't happen to you. And Jesus is going to say what? Get behind me, Satan. He said, you just missed it completely. When you start saying that what I'm here to do has nothing to do with sacrifice and death, then you've jumped ship. And in some ways, the American church has jumped ship because it's not about sacrifice. It's not about endurance with a lot of the American church. Not the whole American church, but just the visible American church seems to be more interested in what we'll find in Laodicea here in a few moments. But the emphasis is clear, even in these letters, that it's my endurance. So why does he say my endurance instead of your endurance? Yes, I agree with you entirely. Jackie's kind of taken an interesting route to get there, but yeah, that's right. She's talking about the high priestly prayer in John chapters 17. And the reason it says my endurance is because our endurance is supposed to look like his endurance. Okay? That's exactly right. So Jesus is going to say, anyone who would come after me must what? All right, I heard take up my cross. I heard die to self. What's the first thing he says, though? Deny yourself, yeah. So y'all know this verse. That's a key verse. And I'm going to be honest with you. When I've taught that verse in Christian churches in North America, people aren't interested in it. They really aren't. Mm-hmm. I agree with that totally. Our idea of perseverance is pretty shallow compared to his. Karen? Ah, very good. Thank you. We'll get this all out here eventually. Okay, so here there is a grammatical ambiguity that makes either of those possible. It could be my word about endurance, or it could be my endurance. So we could translate this verse either way. Either way, you can look at your English translation and see what it does with it. But it could go like this: you have kept the word of my endurance, or you have kept the word about my endurance. But here's the thing. After you study both of those, it's two roads that end up in the same place. Because whether it's Jesus telling us to endure or it's us enduring the way Jesus endures, we end up in the same place. So this is one of those places where a grammatical ambiguity really doesn't change the bottom line meaning. It all comes back to us enduring the same way that Jesus endured. So, because you have kept the word of my endurance, I also will keep you. See those two words there? This is actually one of our words that we're tracking through the book of Revelation, tereo. Remember back in chapter 1 it said, for those who keep these things, that we're supposed to keep the things. So here's a keep right here. This is a keeper, all right? And we're going to see these, so I want to stop right here and point out that one of the things that we're told at the beginning of the book of Revelation that we're to keep is the word of Jesus' endurance. Or in other words, we're supposed to be able to endure the way Jesus endures. So many things flood into my mind when I think about this, when I compare our endurance to his endurance. For one thing, I think about people's complaints about church. And I have plenty of complaints about church too. So, when it's time to do that, y'all be sure and let me know so that I can sign up and complain too. But Jesus went to church with people who were trying to kill him. And the complaints that I hear, I have yet to meet anyone who said that they were having to go to church with someone that was trying to murder them. I've met a lot of people who were insulted. Do you know what she said about me? I'm not going back to that church. I'm frankly amazed sometimes at some of the shallow things that so easily divert people from the work of God. Jesus is saying, hey, I went to church with people who were trying to destroy and murder me. Paul did too. Paul went around and he would always go into the synagogues, and before too long they would take him out and beat him up and leave him for dead. So there is an endurance lacking, and maybe it's because we have the wrong idea of why we're here. I think with North Americans, church a lot of times is about personal development. Personal development. I'm here to make me a better person. Well, maybe, but if that's on the list, it's not in first place. Maybe not even in second place. The main thing is to serve God and represent his kingdom. That will make me a better person. It will develop me. But it's kind of like with the whole idea of friends. If you come looking for friends, you won't find them. But if you come to serve God, you'll find friends. If you come looking for personal development, you'll probably be frustrated. But if you come to serve God, you'll probably get some personal development. So a lot of it is about priority. So he starts out and he says, you've kept my word of endurance, so I'm going to keep you too. He goes on, he says, I'm going to keep you from the hour of testing, which is about to come upon the inhabited earth, all the inhabited earth, to test those who dwell upon the earth. Now, why would this be a support for the pre-tribulation rapture? Can somebody help me out? Okay. First thing to point out is that the words great tribulation aren't in here. Doesn't mean that it's not talking about it, but we have to at least consider that. Instead, it's called what? The hour of testing. That would be the only place in the Bible that the Great Tribulation is called the hour of testing. So we're already kind of in an indirect kind of situation. It could still be true, but it may be talking about something else since it uses language that's different. But it talks about the fact that this hour of trial is unique. Why is it unique? Because it's the whole world. So that does definitely sound like the Great Tribulation. Because ever since the flood, there hasn't been a worldwide judgment by God. What is the tribulation? God's judgment and wrath. All right? There's something else going on in the world at that time, though. It is. Anybody that's on earth is really going to get caught in the crossfire. Because not only is God pouring out his wrath, but the Antichrist is persecuting anyone who will not line up and worship the beast. All of that's going on, which we'll read about. So really, there's two things happening, and both of them are bad. If you're on the earth and you're a believer, and there will be believers on the earth, whether the rapture is pre-tribulation or not. If the rapture is pre-tribulation, there's going to be people saved during the tribulation. And so that raises questions. And they will suffer the wrath of, or have to stay away from the wrath of the Antichrist. Now, let's assume that this is talking about the Great Tribulation when it says the testing that will come upon the whole earth. He's promising here that he will keep them from it. It's interesting here, again, I've never seen anybody really discuss this, but it's a conditional promise, isn't it? Is it possible that some Christians will be left behind and those who have endured and persevered will be taken? I've never heard anybody say that. So just realize that when I say those words tonight, I'm all by myself, okay? But I'm just pointing out that there are other logical possibilities that may not have been considered. Yes, ma'am. Could be. Yeah, left behind, that means they'd be part of the movie, right? All right. So he says, I will keep them from the hour of testing. Now, the next thing that the non-pre-tribulation rapture people say is this keep from, tereo ek. These words occur in one other place too. I can't remember if we looked at this last Sunday night. If we did, I apologize. We'll do it again anyway. Go back to John chapter 17 and verse 15. Jackie was talking about the high priestly prayer. She set me up perfectly for this. This is in Jesus' high priestly prayer right before he went to the cross, or hours before it. He's praying for his disciples, and by extension for all believers. And in verse 15, he prays to the Father and he says, I do not ask that you take them from the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. Exact same words, tereo ek. And obviously here, there's no ambiguity. He's not saying that we be taken out of the world, but in fact that we be kept in the world and that we be protected from the evil one. And so these people would say that's what Revelation 3:10 is saying, that Christians will be in the world, but God will somehow protect them spiritually from the Antichrist. That's in John 17:15. John 17:15 and Revelation 3:10. We have to remember, though, that during the Great Tribulation, whether they are Christians who were here before or not, what is going to happen to a lot of them? There's going to be a lot of martyrs. So, and when Jesus was talking about his followers, when he said kept from the evil one, that obviously didn't mean that they would be kept from all physical persecution. Because of those 11 men that were standing there listening to him pray, how many of them died a natural death? John the Apostle. John, here he is on the Isle of Patmos, probably close to my father's age, in his 80s, and he's the only one left, and has been at this point, since this was written in the 90s, has been probably since the 60s, probably for 20 or more years. He's been the only disciple who's still living, because all of the others, as far as we know, sealed their testimony with their blood. So whatever this protection is, Jesus obviously wasn't talking about a protection that was from physical persecution. But it was a protection from, if it's not a protection from physical persecution, what is it a protection from? Okay. Falling away from God. Okay. So that would come back to this idea of endurance. Jesus wants us to be able to endure, not to give up our faith. Have you noticed in some of these letters that Jesus says, just hold on to what you've got? Because with some of these churches, things were so bad that he counseled them, just grab what you've got and make sure that nobody takes it away from you. Okay? So endurance and perseverance are very, very important for the Lord. Okay? Yes, Jamie? Absolutely. And the word thlipsis is there for tribulation, by the way. Now, the pre-tribulation rapture person would quickly point out, yes, God allows His people to suffer persecution, even martyrdom. But what's different in the Great Tribulation is that God is pouring out His wrath. And what He won't allow His people to endure is to go through His wrath. There's no need for them to. Jesus died on the cross so that we don't have to endure the wrath of God. And so that's, if you're keeping score, that one goes on the side of the pre-tribulation rapture side. Have I confused you completely? I'm trying real hard to. I'm going to confuse you and then straighten you out, hopefully, at some point. But when I get done with you, I hope that you will be deeper in your understanding of the words. Because I don't want you to be like I was for a lot of years. That somebody just stood up and showed me a chart and said, believe this, and I went merry on my way and was all happy until I read the Bible. Now, if you read the Bible and what you believe is challenged by it, then something went wrong somewhere. So we're going to look at these texts. I want you to be familiar with them. You're going to be some of the best schooled people on the pre-tribulation rapture in the church today, all right? And so if you come out the other end believing in the pre-tribulation rapture, your feet are going to be solid on the ground, all right? So we're going to move on from this text here, but let's review the issues that this text has brought up. I want you to keep them in mind and keep thinking about them, all right? That this text does talk about God taking His people out of some large testing period that a lot of people believe is the Great Tribulation, but it doesn't say exactly that it is, and that some people don't think that it means to be taken out, that it means to be protected through it. Okay? Those are kind of the big issues with this text, those two things. Is this the Great Tribulation? And if it is, would God just protect His people in the tribulation, or does He protect them by taking them out of the tribulation? Okay? Remember the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus, where the children of Israel, the Hebrews, how did God deal with them in the midst of that conflagration? From some of them. Yeah, Goshen was shielded from the most intense plagues, but they were still in Egypt at the time. He took them out of Egypt after that. So we'll conclude what we can from that. Kathleen? That's very good. Because you have kept the word of my endurance. All right? They did have requirements. If they didn't put the blood of the lamb on the door, what would happen? They would have lost their firstborn. Yeah. And the indication is that maybe even some Egyptians put the blood on the door. Because they said, you know what? These people serve God. So I'm going with them. So there are Egyptians who left Egypt with the Israelites, realizing, wow, this is God. We're going with these folks. All right, let's move on. There's one more very interesting verse, at least, in these 7 letters. He goes on, he says, I come quickly. Keep what you have. There's that plea again to the church. Don't lose what you've got. Keep what you have so that no one will take your crown from you. This is the Stephanos crown, not the diadem. This is the crown that will be cast at the feet of Jesus. What do you think that crown is? Worship? It's a possibility, because it's an act of worship later when the crowns are cast at the feet of Jesus. What does the crown represent? You think it represents your testimony? Okay, Karen agrees with you. It is. That's the crown he's talking about. The Stephanos was the wreath that was put on at like the Roman games and so forth. But what do we think it symbolizes here for a Christian that they're supposed to hang on to keep anyone from taking it away from them? Probably not our salvation, because that can't be taken away from us. And our salvation is usually not thought of as a crown. Paul talks about the crown this way. He writes to a church and he says, you are my crown. People that he has led to the Lord, people that he's discipling, people that he is mentoring are his crown. I don't know if it's being used the same way here. We're not told. He just tells them, don't let anybody take your crown away from you. But if that's true, may I ask a question? Do you have a crown or some crowns? People that you are discipling, people that you are helping to lead to the Lord or have led to the Lord, and you're helping them to understand the process of walking in the Spirit and so forth. Those are the crowns, if that's correct, those are the crowns that we would throw at the feet of the Lord. That makes sense, because what else would the Lord care about? Do you think we're going to carry gold to heaven and throw that at his feet? Does he care about gold, silver, precious stones? Karen? Precious stones in our crown, yeah. That is the way that I've always taken that, Karen. Karen says, isn't that when we lead someone to Christ? The way that I've always envisioned casting crowns at Jesus' feet is presenting people to him that we have helped encourage and lead to the Lord. That's the way that I've always envisioned that. And so there might be some people that have several hands on them, because there might be 10 or 15 people that contributed to a person's salvation. And so to use the symbology, there might be 10 people holding one crown together to throw it at the feet of Jesus. I don't know how it all is going to work, but the symbol is certainly not about gold or silver. God doesn't care about those things. What are the things that we build on the foundation? 1 Corinthians chapter 3 says that Christ is the foundation, and then he warns us, be careful how you build on that foundation. Wood, hay, stubble, it's going to get burned up. But precious stones, as Karen mentioned, those will be there, and there's a reward for those. What are they? Well, we talked about it this morning. The living stones in the wall of the temple of God. There are living stones out there that we can help put into place. And in some sense, those are our crowns that we will cast at the feet of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 3 makes it clear that some will not have any crowns to cast at the feet of Jesus. They're just going to be happy to be there. And being there is going to be a big deal. Absolutely. No argument with that. Then he goes on in verse 12 and he says, to the one who overcomes. Actually, John does something unusual here, and he does this kind of thing all through this letter. And it's smoothed out in our English translations. This hanikon, the overcomer, has no clear grammatical connection to the rest of the sentence. It's not to the one who overcomes. It is simply the overcomer. Here it is literally. He says, the overcomer, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. It's a minor point, but it's dramatic the way that he writes it. He doesn't, it's not to the overcomer I will make, or for the overcomer I will make. He makes a declaration. And then he says, the overcomer, I will make him a pillar. Very dramatic. And John writes in a very dramatic way all through this book. So, the overcomer, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. That's unusual, isn't it? Because we've been talking about living stones. But here we have the idea of some people, at least, being pillars in the temple of my Lord. What does that make you think about? What would be the difference between being a brick in the wall or being a pillar? We talk about the pillars of the community, right? Who are they? Oh, the important ones? Those who put the community first. They are people who stabilize the community. They're people who, if they were suddenly gone, the community would not be as strong anymore for some reason. Okay, and he's saying here that the overcomer is someone that is a pillar in the temple of my God, and I will certainly not put him out. I will write upon him the name of my God. Now, this is interesting. And the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down from heaven, from my God, and the name, and my new name. I love this part. I really want to know what that new name is. What is Jesus' new name? No way for us to know now. We'll have to wait and find out. But that's a fascinating idea, that there's a name that we don't know about Jesus. How many names do we already know for Jesus? If you had to start writing them down, what would they be? Name some of them. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Bright Morning Star? Okay, stop, Jack. Y'all need to catch up. Counselor, all right? What's the one that we read often in the book of Revelation? Starts with an L. Lamb. And another animal, starts with an L. Lion from the tribe of Judah, the lamb. What other names? Alpha and Omega in the book of Revelation. Emmanuel, God who is with us. And we could probably go on for a while. We already have a lot of names for Jesus. The Christ, the Messiah. But apparently he's got some new name. And I'm curious. I hope you are too. And then verse 13, he finishes off that letter as he does the other ones. The one who has an ear to hear, let him hear. The one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. All right, we'll just kind of start this letter and then stop. Yes, ma'am. That is the implication, and I wanted to talk about that when we got to the end of the 7 letters, but I'm glad that you brought it up. The hanikon. What if you're not a hanikon? What are you if you're not a hanikon? If you're not an overcomer, then what are you? Are you still a believer? Are you still going to heaven? That's a good question. What do you think, Jamie? Yeah, yeah. And it could be that those are the believers that are talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where they just come through as if through the flame, Paul says. I always got this idea that they're sort of brushing hell off of themselves as they step into heaven because they just barely missed it, That's my brain. So you may be right about that. Jack? No matter what. That's right. And if they have that testimony, Cindy? We're automatically overcomers. And that's a good theological point. When we're in Christ, we are overcomers, period. But it's obvious in these 7 letters that Jesus is encouraging these believers not to lose something. And so the question would be, what is it that he's encouraging them not to lose? Certainly not their salvation, because that wouldn't fit in with our theology, and he never comes right out and says that. And so then we're back to Jamie's question. Certainly not everybody's going to be a pillar in the temple. I think he's encouraging us to excel. I definitely believe that there will be some believers who excel and others who don't. Anybody else on that? That's an interesting subject. We're all the way back to the letter to Ephesus now, your first love. So I'll try to finish we have the letter to Laodicea next week, and we'll see if we can't finish it. If you're interested in studying these on your own, let me give you a little homework assignment. Go back and look now at the 6 letters that we've discussed, and you can go ahead and look at Laodicea as well, and write down one thing that stands out from each one of these letters to you. Not from the end or the beginning, but the body of the letter. The body of the letter where he is addressing the church itself. And we'll talk about the beginning and the end too. And see if we can kind of get a global message, as it were, from these 7 letters. Next week, our goal will be to look at the last verse of the last body section of the last letter, which is also a controversial verse. I'll just read it to you. Look at 3:20, chapter 3 and verse 20. Look, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in toward him, and I will dine with him, and he with me. This is an interesting verse that is misused, I think, a lot. So you read that and think about it, and God willing, we'll try to get from the beginning, verse 14, down to verse 20, and talk about that. Then we come to chapter 4, where we get to go to heaven, and I love that part, so I'm looking forward to that. You know what I mean by that. We're not going to come and drink any kind of Kool-Aid or anything, all right? So didn't want to leave that hanging out there. All right. Let's pray. Have you got a song for us, Blake? Okay, let's pray and we'll sing and be dismissed. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word, for your spirits. Please illuminate our spirits, enable us to understand all that you want us to, not to worry about things that you don't want us to know now. I thank you for my brothers and sisters here, God, and I pray especially for each individual, each household, each family, Lord, that we would be overcomers, that we would endure. In Jesus' name, amen.